The intake form asked for species designation, enhancement tier, and combat rating. Lieutenant Commander Sera Voss filled in the first field, left the second blank, and wrote unclassified in the third. The processing clerk at Nexera Command stared at the form for a long moment, then looked up at the woman standing across the desk. "You are human," the clerk said. It was not a question. It had the flat tone of someone confirming an inconvenience. "Last I checked," Sera said. The clerk stamped the form anyway. The Meridian Integration Program was not advertised as the hardest joint species training cycle in the known coalition. It did not need to be. Its reputation traveled the way bad weather does, quietly and ahead of schedule. Candidates arrived knowing the numbers. Of the 43 species who had attempted full certification in the program's 11-year history, fewer than a third had produced graduates. The attrition was not brutal in the way that wars are brutal. It was surgical. Precise. The program was designed by Commander Ysenth, a Velthari strategist with 4 decades of combined operational and academic experience, and it was designed with one operating belief sitting at its center like a stone at the bottom of a river. Competence without pressure is opinion. Everything in the program existed to separate opinion from fact. Ysenth himself was a tall, narrow-framed figure with pale silver skin that shifted faintly when his mood changed, a Velthari trait he had long since stopped trying to suppress. He stood at the orientation balcony on the first morning of the new cycle and looked down at the assembled candidates with the patience of someone who had done this many times and felt no need to perform it. 31 candidates stood in the courtyard below. Diverse in shape, in size, in stillness. The Dravekki pair near the left flank stood almost perfectly still, their secondary eyelids cycling slowly, metabolisms already managing the morning heat. The Horra cluster of 4 occupied the center with the easy confidence of a species that had produced more coalition officers than any other in the last century. A single Ysenth stood apart from everyone, tall and angular, sensor filaments retracted, which meant either focus or suspicion. Ysenth had learned not to assume which. Then there were the humans. 3 of them, placed near the back of the formation not by design, but because they had arrived last, having apparently spent 12 minutes helping a maintenance drone that had become caught in a cargo lift on sublevel 4. Ysenth had watched it on the security feed. The drone had not asked for help. The humans had simply noticed it was stuck and stopped. The one in the center was Sera Voss. Medium height, composed, with a kind of posture that came not from training but from comfort inside her own body. To her left stood a compact man named House, who had the look of someone perpetually calculating something just below the surface of his expression. To her right, a younger woman named Priya Okafor stood with her chin slightly up, not in defiance, just in the habit of watching horizon lines. Ysenth activated his comm link and his voice reached the courtyard without needing to be raised. "You have been selected because your performance records suggested you were worth the investment of this program's time. That assessment may prove correct. It may not. You will not know which until the program decides for you." He paused. "This cycle runs for 60 days. In that time you will be evaluated continuously. There are no rest days. There are recovery periods, which are different. Rest implies the absence of demand. Recovery implies preparation for the next one. This program does not offer absence of demand. It offers clarity about what demand actually is." He looked across the courtyard. "Begin orientation now." The first week was information. Dense, constant, deliberately unstructured. Candidates were given access to a shared tactical library containing thousands of operational documents, terrain analyses, species-specific physiological notes, and historical case studies from 40 years of coalition operations. They were given no reading list, no priorities, no guidance on what was relevant. Just access, and 12 hours a day to make use of it. Most candidates organized by category. The Horra divided the library among their 4 and coordinated summaries. The Dravekki pair worked in tandem, one reading while the other mapped connective threads. The Ysenth worked alone and in silence, which was standard. Sera Voss read for an hour on the first day, then spent the rest of the morning walking the facility. House watched her go from across the reading room, then returned to his notes. Priya Okafor followed Sera after 20 minutes, not because she had been asked to, but because she was curious. "You are not reading," Priya said, catching up in the corridor outside the Eastern Maintenance Wing. "I am reading," Sera said. Different text. Priya looked around. The corridor was functional and plain, built for access, not observation. Conduit lines ran overhead. Air recycling units hummed at the joints. The building, Priya said slowly. The building, the routing logic, the pressure differentials in the ventilation, the way the lighting system dims in sections when power is redistributed. This place tells you how it was designed to function and where it was designed to fail. That is useful information. Priya considered this. It is not in the library. Nothing important ever is. They walked the facility together for the rest of that morning, and Priya began to see what Sera was reading. By the end of the first week, Idritha's instructors had compiled preliminary profiles on all 31 candidates. The reports were consistent with expectations in most cases. The Horra were coordinated and efficient but showed early signs of framework dependence, meaning they performed excellently within structures they understood and hesitated when structures were removed. The Dravekki were analytically precise but physiologically conservative, which in operational terms meant they calculated well and moved cautiously, sometimes too cautiously. The Ysenth was exceptional by almost every metric and already showing the isolation pattern common to its species, an advantage in individual performance and a risk in team contexts. The human profiles created a brief discussion in the instructor room. Voss is not using the library as directed, one instructor noted. There was no direction given, Ysenth said. The implicit direction. The other candidates understood the implicit direction. The other candidates assumed an implicit direction and acted on that assumption, Ysenth said. Voss tested the space before deciding how to use it. Note the difference. There was quiet in the room. House, another instructor continued, has been cross-referencing the operational documents against the facility's original construction logs. He found them in the administrative archive. No one else looked there. What did he find? That 3 of the rooms listed as storage bays in the current layout were originally designed as isolation chambers. He flagged it with a note that reads, and I am quoting, "This seems like information we might need later." Ysenth looked at the note for a moment. He is right. And Okafor? She has been running timed routes between every key location in the facility. She has done it 4 times each, at different hours. She has mapped response lag in the security lighting and identified 2 corridors where audio monitoring has a gap. The room was very quiet. She did not try to exploit the gaps, the instructor added. She documented them and left the documentation in the shared candidate file where every instructor can see it. Ysenth looked at the profiles again for a long time. Then he set them down. Move the second phase up by 2 days. Phase 2 was team composition, which in the Meridian program meant something more specific and more uncomfortable than the name suggested. Candidates were placed into mixed species groups of 4 and given operational scenarios that could not be completed by any one candidate alone. The scenarios were designed to require genuine collaboration, meaning they were also designed to make genuine collaboration as difficult as possible. Information asymmetry, communication constraints, objectives that appeared to conflict but did not if examined closely enough. The program's internal name for this phase was the Grinder, not because it was violent but because it was relentless. Sera's group included herself, the Ysenth, a Horra named Krex who had been the most senior of the 4-member cluster, and a Dravekki named Luth whose partner had withdrawn from the program in week 1 with a stress fracture. Their first scenario was delivered at 0400 with no prior notice. A simulated forward operating base under supply constraint, communications intermittent, 3 separate objectives requiring resources that could not simultaneously serve all 3. Krex took command immediately, which was instinct, and began assigning roles with the efficiency of someone used to coordinating. The Ysenth, whose name in Sera's phonetics came out as something close to Eris, accepted a role and began working it without comment. Luth organized the available supply data with methodical care. Sera sat down on the floor of the briefing room. Krex looked at her. Voss. Working, she said. You have been assigned. I know. Give me 90 seconds. Krex's secondary crest, a fine ridge of bioluminescent tissue that ran from crown to shoulder, flickered with something between irritation and uncertainty. The Ysenth paused its work to observe. Luth continued sorting data. Sera was not doing nothing. She was sitting with a scenario in her head, not organizing it but feeling its shape, the way you feel for the edge of something in the dark before you try to pick it up. She had learned, through years of field postings and one very hard 6-month deployment in a collapsed infrastructure zone on a planet whose name she could still not pronounce correctly, that the first 90 seconds of a problem were the most expensive time to spend moving. Everybody moved. Nobody thought. Then everybody spent the next 6 hours correcting their first 30 seconds of motion. She looked up. The objectives are not actually in conflict. Krex turned. The resource allocation clearly. The resource allocation as listed creates conflict, yes. But Objective 2 can be downgraded from full completion to operational sufficiency with a 12% resource reduction and still achieve the functional goal, which frees enough to run Objectives 1 and 3 in parallel with overlap sharing at the midpoint. It does not look like a solution because it requires accepting partial success on 2 rather than treating it as a binary pass or fail. Silence. Eris made a soft sound that Sera had already learned, in 3 days of shared spaces, meant recalibrating. Krex looked at the data again. Sera watched him find it, the moment when the arrangement suddenly looked different, the way a drawing of a vase becomes 2 faces and cannot become a vase again. His crest shifted to a cooler hue. This requires all 4 of us to operate on overlapping tasks simultaneously, he said. Yes. Horra coordination doctrine separates task ownership to minimize interference. I know. It is very effective doctrine for sequential problems. This one is not sequential. Luth spoke from behind the supply display, voice careful and quiet. She is correct. I have been seeing the same shape but did not have the framework to name it. A beat. I do now. They ran the scenario with Sera's framework. They completed all 3 objectives, including Objective 2 at 91% efficacy, which cleared the operational sufficiency threshold by a margin comfortable enough to matter. The scenario clock stopped. The debrief flag from the instructor monitoring system lit up in the corner of the display with a single word. Unexpected. Idrith watched the recording of the scenario twice. Not the outcome. The 90 seconds of Sera sitting on the floor while her team moved around her. He had spent 11 years watching candidates under pressure. He had seen bravado and he had seen paralysis and he had seen everything in the space between. He had never seen someone voluntarily go still in the middle of motion and do it without apology or explanation, with the complete ease of a person who had decided long ago that looking like you were doing nothing was an acceptable cost for actually understanding something. He called up her service record again. 6 postings. 1 commendation for a logistics solution that had kept a forward unit operational for 11 days past its supply window. 2 notes about unconventional problem approaches, both filed by commanding officers who had clearly been uncertain whether to frame them as praise or complaint. 1 psychological evaluation that used the phrase comfortable with ambiguity 3 times in 4 pages. He set the record down and looked out at the training floor where candidates were running afternoon drills. He had a meeting with the program's funding council in 3 days. They had been asking, as they periodically did, whether the inclusion criteria should be adjusted, which was their careful way of asking whether species without Tier 2 enhancements were a worthwhile investment of training resources. He had been preparing a defense built on operational outcome data and cost-benefit analysis. He set that aside too. He began writing something different. Week 3 brought the environmental phase, which candidates had been warned about in general terms and which was still, without exception, a different experience than the warning suggested. The program used a modular terrain facility 3 levels below the main complex. It could simulate a range of operational environments with enough fidelity to produce real physiological stress. Extreme cold, extreme heat, low oxygen, high pressure, sensory disruption, terrain instability. Candidates cycled through environments in sequences designed to prevent adaptation, meaning that just as a body began to find its operational rhythm in one condition, the condition changed. Sera moved through the cold chamber with the unhurried economy of someone doing something familiar. Dory, in the adjacent lane, was moving slightly faster and using slightly more energy. Priya was behind both of them, breathing in a deliberate pattern she had clearly been practicing, her movements conservative but her expression entirely steady. What the instructors watching the environmental phase noticed first was not performance. It was response pattern to failure. Every candidate failed something in this phase. Sera fell through an unstable ice section in the cold chamber on day 2. She fell completely, into water cold enough to shock the system, and the monitoring team had their hands on the extraction protocols before she surfaced. She surfaced immediately, oriented herself in 3 seconds, identified the nearest stable edge, moved to it, pulled herself out, took stock of her condition, judged it operational, and continued the route. She did not shout. She did not panic. She spent approximately 2 seconds registering that the ice had failed and approximately 0 seconds being angry about it. Dory, when he hit the same section on day 3, having watched Sera's footage in the candidate review sessions, stepped around it. Priya stepped around it too, but she also marked it on her map with a note that the ice failure point was located 3 meters east of the position indicated on the standard chart, suggesting a calibration drift in the environmental system. She submitted the note to the instructor file that evening. The Ysenth, Eris, moved through the cold chamber with efficiency but hit the heat sequence with something that the physiological monitors identified as early stress cascade. Not breakdown. Not failure. But elevation. Eris worked through it alone, methodically, and completed the sequence, but the completion time was higher than the cold chamber by a ratio that concerned the medical team. Sera noticed. She mentioned nothing in the group setting. She found Eris the following morning in the equipment room, alone and recalibrating thermal regulation gear. She sat nearby, not immediately adjacent, and began working on her own equipment. After several minutes, she said, without preamble, the heat phase uses radiant distribution instead of ambient loading. It means the heat comes from the surface upward rather than the air inward. Ysenth physiology thermoregulates from the core outward, which means you are working against the gradient instead of with it. Eris was very still. You have studied Ysenth physiology. I spent a week at a joint posting with the Ysenth engineering unit 4 years ago. I paid attention. Why are you telling me this? It was not structured as a question. The Ysenth language did not always inflect questions the same way, and Sera had learned this too. Because you have been the most consistent performer in this group since day 1, and watching you compensate for a gradient problem with raw effort when there is a technique adjustment available seems like a waste. There was a long pause. The equipment room hummed with recycled air. What is the adjustment? Sera told her. Eris completed the second heat sequence 3 days later with a completion time that put her at the top of the candidate pool. Ysenth heard about this from the medical team, who had flagged the physiological data anomaly and traced it to the technique shift. He sat with the information for a morning before calling Sera into his office. She came in and sat down in the indicated chair without looking around the room the way candidates sometimes did, assessing, positioning. She simply sat and gave him her attention. You coached Eris, he said. I shared information, she said. The distinction. Coaching implies I directed her. I gave her data and she decided how to use it. She is more than capable of the rest. Ysenth looked at her. You are aware this is a competitive program. Candidates are ranked individually. I am aware. Improving another candidate's performance has no direct benefit to your ranking. Sera appeared to think about this the way someone thinks about a statement that is technically accurate and functionally incomplete. Eris has sensor and analytical capabilities that none of the rest of us have. We are going to end up in units together after this. Having her operating at full capacity is worth more than whatever ranking margin I might gain from her operating below it. She paused. Also, it was the right thing to do. Ysenth said nothing. Is there a policy against it? Sera asked. No, he said. Then I am not sure what the meeting is for. He almost smiled. It is for me to understand something. She waited. In 11 years of running this program, I have had candidates who were technically brilliant. I have had candidates who were physically exceptional. I have had candidates who were exceptional leaders. I have never had a candidate who appeared to treat the entire concept of competition as secondary to the concept of function. He looked at her directly. Where does that come from? Sera was quiet for a moment. Not evasive. Considering. We are a young species, she said finally. We have been failing at things for our entire history. We failed at agriculture and we learned irrigation. We failed at disease and we learned medicine. We failed at building and the buildings fell and we learned architecture from the rubble. Failure is not something that happened to us. It is something we grew up inside of. She settled back slightly. A course that is designed to be difficult does not frighten us. It looks like the next problem in a very long series of problems that we are still here because we kept solving. She looked at him evenly. Other species evolved with strengths. We evolved with the habit of continuing. That is not better or worse. It is just different. Ysenth was quiet for a long time after she left. The final phase of the Meridian program was called integration, and it was the only phase that did not have hidden variables or concealed objectives. Candidates were told exactly what it was. They were given a real operational planning task, drawn from an actual pending coalition mission with classified details redacted, and they were asked to produce a viable plan as a mixed group over 72 hours. Ysenth had added one additional element this cycle. He gave the group the option to choose their own composition. It had never been offered before. He did not explain why he was offering it now. The candidates took 40 minutes to discuss it. Sera did not speak first. She did not engineer the outcome. She listened to the group find its own way to the conclusion, which was that the most functional team for the task included all three humans, Eris, Krex, and Luth. Which was, Ysenth noted when he received the group's composition list, nearly identical to what his own instructor team would have assigned. The 72-hour plan that came out of that room was the most thorough and operationally coherent document the program had produced in 6 cycles. Not because it was perfect. It contained 3 acknowledged uncertainties and 2 explicit contingency gaps that the group had flagged themselves, noting clearly that the available information was insufficient to close them and that closing them with assumptions would be worse than leaving them open. Ysenth had been receiving plans from candidates for 11 years, and very few of them had ever been honest about what they did not know. Most plans papered over gaps with confident language. This one labeled them and explained why labeling was more useful than papering. He sent the document to the coalition operations team without comment. 3 days later he received a response. The operations team had used the plan as a framework. They noted they had filled 2 of the 3 acknowledged uncertainties with information from field intelligence. The third gap remained open. Standard for this kind of operation, the response said. Usually the gap closes on the ground. Good to know the team working it will already have it marked. Graduation from the Meridian program was not ceremonial. There was no parade, no formal assembly. Candidates who completed the program received their certification notation in their service record and their assignment orders simultaneously. It was deliberately anticlimactic, which was itself a design choice. The program's completion was not the achievement. The assignment was. Sera received her orders in the early morning, sitting in the same chair in the reading room where she had first decided the library was not the most important text available to her. She read the assignment, noted the posting, folded the slate, and sat with it for a moment. Dory appeared in the doorway. "Where?" he asked. "Frontier Coordination Unit. Mixed species. Long operational windows." He nodded. "Sounds right. You. Infrastructure integration at the Kestrel Hub. They apparently want someone who reads construction logs." He said it with a faint wry quality that passed for humor in Dory's register. Priya arrived behind him, already carrying her field pack. "I am going to a mapping survey. 6 planets, unknown terrain, small team." She did not seem concerned. She seemed, if anything, interested. Sera stood and shouldered her own pack. Eris was in the corridor beyond the door, her sensor filaments extended, reading the air of the facility one last time in the way of a creature cataloging a place it was leaving. Krex stood near the exit with the contained formality of someone who had reconsidered several assumptions and was still in the process of settling them. Luth was already outside, checking the transport manifest with habitual precision. Ysenth met them at the main entrance. Not all program directors did this. He had done it every cycle for 11 years, without exception. He stood before the group and said what he always said. The program has prepared you for conditions. It has not prepared you for specifics. You will encounter specifics that this program did not anticipate. That is the point of view. He looked at each of them in turn. When he reached Sera, she met his eyes and gave a single nod, the compact, unadorned acknowledgement of someone who has understood something without needing it explained a second time. He returned it. They walked out into the transport bay and distributed into separate vehicles with the practical efficiency of people who had learned to pack light and move clean. Ysenth stood in the entrance for a moment after they were gone. Then he went back to his office and sat down at his desk and looked at the blank rating field on the program's internal evaluation form, the one that had read exceptional difficulty, expected attrition above 60% for 11 cycles without revision. He deleted the description. He sat for a while, thinking about how to say what he now understood. Then he wrote, "Difficulty is not a fixed property of a challenge. It is a ratio between what the challenge demands and what the candidate carries into it. This program has not changed. Our understanding of what candidates carry has." He paused. "Adjust nothing about the course. Adjust everything about the assumption that discomfort is an obstacle rather than a medium. Some candidates have spent their lives learning to work inside difficulty without waiting for it to stop. For those candidates, hard conditions are not the problem. They are simply where the work happens." He looked at what he had written. Then, in the notes field at the bottom of the form, he added one final line, not for the record but because it was true. They did not complete the program. The program completed them. And in doing so, it finally understood what it was for. He saved the file, stood, and walked out to the platform overlooking the empty training floor. Somewhere on the other side of the transit network, Sera Voss was already reading her new terrain.